And you're going to just lead us right into Mr. Thorpe, who we're so delighted to have today.
Absolutely. And it is absolutely an honor to bring Mr. Ryan Thorpe with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I know Ryan through his work, of course, because I was following the same story. And since 2019, he is so kind. He comes to my class and speaks to the young people about the danger, vulnerability of this kind of movement in Canada. So Ryan Thorpe, his official bio that we could gather, and he likes the pace of daily news, feeling of a broadsheet in his hands, and the stress of never-ending deadlines hanging over his head. Quite a handful of title to begin with. He believes journalism is not a career, but a calling. I think he has proved it, ladies and gentlemen. He has proved it. And that rather than being something you do, a journalist, something you are. He graduated top of his class from Niagara College's journalism program in 2017 as a student reporter. He picked up on Ontario Community Newspaper Awards nomination for a story on food bank use in Southern Ontario. He also served as an editor on an investigative project into the state of student mental health on post-secondary campuses, which won a 2017 Emerge Media Award. Ryan is a former intern at the Hamilton Spectator, where he co-authored 6-week investigation report on drug use in the city's high schools. Afterwards, he landed a summer internship at the Free Press in June 17, and since then he has managed to find a way to stick around the newspaper. What a news. And we have Ryan Thorpe with us. Ryan, the floor is yours, sir. And once again, our deep gratitude for your time today. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation to come speak today. So I'm a reporter at the Free Press, and since I've been working at the newspaper, I've covered a few different stories that kind of overlap with extremism, particularly the far-right hate movement. The first story I probably ever did on that was an individual named Paul Frum, who's a pretty prominent kind of white supremacist in Canada, who actually tried to come to Winnipeg and host a conference here to talk to other kind of racists in the city. There's been a couple of recruitment drives that I've covered. One was out of Brandon University a few years back. It was 2017 or 2018. There was an attempt to hold a hate rally in Winnipeg in 2017 that I covered. But most of my experience, and certainly the work that I'm most well known for on this kind of beat, is the Patrick Matthews case. And so I'll just kind of quickly run over the kind of main elements of that story. So it began in the summer of 2019, and there were these posters that were kind of popping up in different areas of the city that were recruitment posters for this kind of weird, mysterious neo-Nazi group called the Base. We had gotten a news tip about this at the Free Press. It was assigned to me, and I'd never heard about them. And when I looked online, I actually couldn't find much information about them aside from a single news article that Vice News had done. And it turned out this was a group that had been founded in the United States in 2018. There was a number of former military members in the United States connected to the group. And, within a period of about 6 to 9 months, they were expanding their kind of foothold into Canada. And now we had a recruitment drive for them here. One of the things that was quite concerning is that it was far more militaristic and frankly terroristic in nature than anything I had seen in Manitoba before. It wasn't, a few people turning out with hateful signs at a rally. This appeared to be an attempt to create something more akin to like a small cell in the prairies that would be kind of specifically geared towards terroristic activity. So after trying to figure out how I could learn more about this, what would be the best way to get to the bottom of it, figure out who was behind it. Ultimately, I made the decision with one of my editors to reach out to this group posing as a white nationalist who was interested in learning more and joining up. And over the course of a couple of weeks, I was kind of put through this multi-tiered vetting process. I was communicating with the founder of this group on an encrypted messaging app, and I had to speak to them on the phone. I had to answer questionnaires and different questions about my political and ideological worldview. And this culminated in a meeting with their local recruiter in Winnipeg. So yeah, in the summer of 2019, I went to Whittier Park where I'd set up a meeting with this individual who I didn't know who it was. I met them in person, and they were very clearly like a fanatic. They were quoting obscure white supremacists and neo-Nazis off the top of the head. They were talking about committing violence in Winnipeg against local activists. They discussed the possibility of derailing a train. And they told me that they were a member of the Canadian military trained as a combat engineer. Up until this point, or I guess at that point, I didn't know if what this person was telling me was true, but I was obviously very concerned. I was concerned seeing these posters and figuring out what this group stood for. And, over the course of a couple of weeks, I managed to meet this person, gain their trust, and then they're telling me they're in the military and are kind of openly talking about the possibility of committing acts of violence. So I became increasingly concerned that this was a serious threat to our community. And I set about trying to figure out who this individual was. And, pretty quickly, I was able to confirm their identity. It was a guy named Patrick Matthews. He was a combat engineer in the Canadian Army Reserves. He had been trained in the use of explosives. And he had been traveling from Winnipeg down to the United States to meet up with other neo-Nazis and engage in paramilitary training. And now he was recruiting in Manitoba because he wanted to get someone else here to commence paramilitary training in our backyard. And that's what he thought he was recruiting me for. Ultimately, we published one article before we knew who this guy was. We published a follow-up article identifying him as a member of the military. And then, the story got pretty crazy. He disappears. The RCMP puts out a missing persons report. About a week later, his truck turns up near the US-Canada border and, indicating that he had likely fled to the United States. No one hears from him for about a 5-month period until news breaks in the New York Times that he's been arrested by the FBI. At that point, I start back on the story and reporting out what I can. And subsequently, we've been able to piece together a timeline of events. So after we exposed him in Winnipeg, he crosses over on foot into the United States. Other members of this organization drive more than 500 miles to pick him up. They provide him safe harbor at multiple different states across the US. At one point they're in an apartment in Newark, Delaware. At another point they're in a hotel in Maryland, and eventually he gets taken down to rural Georgia, where one of the members of the group has this kind of sprawling compound where they're holding paramilitary training events. While he's down there, he's involved with hatching a double murder plot with other members of the group. And then eventually he moves into an apartment full-time in Newark, Delaware. He, with one of his co-conspirators, they build a ghost gun, like a untraceable assault rifle. They have a sniper rifle that they deck out with all sorts of, accessories like thermal imaging and things like that. They amass more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. They have body armor. They have months worth of meals ready to eat, radio equipment, gas masks, like pretty much anything you would need if you have violence on your mind. And they begin plotting to drive down to pro-Second Amendment rally in Richmond, Virginia, and open up fire on the crowd. Because they essentially just want to create violence and chaos in order to destabilize society and spark a race war. That's kind of their overall theory and motivation. But what Patrick Matthews and other members of the group didn't know was that they were the subject of a pretty significant FBI investigation, and that the FBI had been kind of on them for months, and they had actually sent in an undercover agent who infiltrated the group. And in January 2020, shortly before this rally is supposed to happen that Matthews was planning to attack, he's arrested, and all told 11 members of the group are arrested in various US states. So there's a cell in Georgia that's arrested for a double murder plot. There's Matthews and his co-conspirator who are arrested as they're kind of gearing up for a terror attack. There was one member who was arrested for coordinating a nationwide campaign to vandalize and damage synagogues. There's others who are arrested for weapons offenses. One guy's even arrested as he sleeps in bed with, a gun next to him, and the FBI storms in. ultimately, I went down, covered all of his court cases, and this past October, Patrick Matthews was sentenced to 9 years in U.S. federal prison for various firearm offenses. There's no domestic terror laws on the books in the United States, so ultimately he got sentenced to gun charges, although the judge in the case did implement this sentencing enhancement for domestic terrorism. So they did rule that what he was doing was in furtherance of a terroristic cause. So that's kind of, broadly speaking, the Patrick Matthews case that that I broke here in Winnipeg. This is kind of one small subset of the far-right hate movement today, is what I would call neo-Nazi accelerationists. That's what groups like the Base or Adam Waffen Division or a few others are like. But this is perhaps some of the most radical, potentially violent fringes of the far-right hate movement, but it's much larger than groups like this. And the best research I've seen in Canada in terms of the scope of the problem here has been from an academic named Dr. Barbara Perry, whose work suggests there's been a real kind of explosion of active hate groups in Canada over a few-year period. When she began tracking, I think this was in 2015, she found about 100 active hate groups in the country, and then 3 years later, when she went to update her list, it was more than 300. And it's been a while since I've spoken to her, so I'm not sure where that number is today, but that's obviously some very concerning trends. We've seen a lot of connections between the military and the far-right hate movement in this country. Just a caveat, this isn't to suggest that there's countless extremists in the military. Like, obviously this doesn't reflect on the vast majority of men and women who serve, but there have been a lot of cases over the years that have identified extremists in the military, which is a huge cause for concern, because they're trained and they have firearms and explosives knowledge. There was a military report in 2018 that it identified, I think it was about 53 members who were either straight up members of hate groups or had undergone some process of radicalization towards an extremist cause, and they had been identified. And most disturbing to me was something like 30 of them remained active duty in the military. So for a long time, what we've seen is, even as these people are identified, they slip up and they come on the radar and their views are exposed. The military isn't really sure how to handle those cases or what to do, and often they remain actively serving members. And as far as I can tell, the kind of far-right hate movement in this country, it's split into what I would call, in one case, like movement builders, people that are interested in mass political movements, trying to build broad public support, maybe even in some cases trying to infiltrate or ally more mainstream political parties and hijack them to their purposes. And on the other hand, you have kind of like vanguardists, people like Patrick Matthews or the Base, who aren't really looking to appeal to the public. They're looking to only get kind of the most fringy, hardcore elements together in these small cells, commit acts of violence in order to further their goals. So yeah, a couple of things that came to mind. I mean, I think the timing for a project like the one you're all undertaking here, it's incredibly good timing for something like this. I mean, what we're seeing is increased negative polarization across society. We're seeing the proliferation of conspiracy theories online. We're seeing kind of a resurgence of right-wing populism globally. And, as some other folks have mentioned, as the events of this past weekend show, I think we're seeing increasing numbers of people kind of falling out of the political mainstream onto the fringes. And those trends seem to be accelerating. And I mean, how you address that as a society is a question that's well above my pay grade. I'm not sure how you do, but I think a project like this is certainly one tool in the toolkit. Matthews, he grew up and was raised in Manitoba. He was educated in Manitoba. He worked here. There was a lot of people over his life, be it teachers or colleagues and coworkers or other soldiers in the military or bosses and friends and family, who missed a lot of red flags with this guy. And so if those red flags could have been caught sooner, before he had gotten so deep into the depths of this really hateful and vile ideology, it's possible perhaps an intervention maybe would have been able to pull him back from the ledge before he ended up where he did, and before he, I mean, he's going to serve about a decade of his life in a U.S. federal prison, which is, I mean, and as terrible as that is, it's like a waste of human potential. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve what he got. He made his bed. He has to lay in it. But he's lucky that he was arrested before someone got hurt. Because from my standpoint, the entire time I was covering the story, I was really concerned it was going to end with someone dead, if maybe even more people. And I think that was a distinct possibility. And as Causer pointed out, it's these cases happen here. It's not just the Matthews case or the ramming of Rito Hall. You take it back to the 90s, and Matt McKay, who was one of the key figures in the Somalia affair, which I'm sure some people remember, the Canadian military on the peacekeeping mission in Somalia in the early 90s. He was stationed in Winnipeg, and he was criminally charged with a hate crime here for the murder of Gordon Cuddy, who was a man who was murdered behind the Manitoba Legislative Building because he was gay. And so we've seen violence here. We've seen what happens when you turn a blind eye to these sorts of movements, and they fester in the shadows. So I think the work like this project is setting out to do is incredibly important. And yeah, maybe I'll just I'll leave it there, because I usually think the Q&A portion of these things is more interesting than just having me ramble on. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Ryan.
There are 2 questions.
Great, thanks, Linda. Do you want to lead the questions?
Yeah, thanks. The first question is, Ryan, is there a connection to any mainstream political parties that you discovered in your research?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you go back to the early 90s and with the Heritage Front and their attempts to infiltrate the Reform Party in Canada. So we've seen far-right infiltration into more mainstream parties in the past in this country. And then I think the most obvious current example is the People's Party of Canada, which struck me as something of like a vanity project for Maxime Bernier, but I think he's somewhat consciously playing with fire and trying to appeal to some more fringy elements of Canadian society. I think the pandemic has, quite frankly, broken a lot of people's brains, and we've seen just kind of an uptick in the amount of seemingly normal people who are buying into some pretty out there views, and I think social media is something of an accelerant for the spread of conspiracy theories, and so I'm not really sure how you kind of pull back on that, but yeah, so I mean, there is kind of cross-pollination with mainstream political parties. Even this past weekend, we saw Aaron O'Toole kind of go out and try and meet the truckers and appeal to them, and I'm not exactly sure what he was hoping to accomplish there, but it's I think that's a major cause for concern, and it'll be interesting to track over the coming years whether or not these sorts of fringy elements in Canadian society continues to grow.
Thank you. And the second question sort of is related. Just wondering, is this could this potentially be a mass political movement, or is it just vanguardists that you mentioned? And was there any connection to the first group that you mentioned, connection between what happened this weekend and the first group that you mentioned?
So in terms of the base, that group is pretty much dead at this point. 11 members were arrested across the United States. So I think that even people that were members or were perhaps kind of curious onlookers that might join in the future, everyone's been pretty much turned off it, just because no one wants to be involved in an organization that has been subjected to that level of infiltration and has seen that many arrests. Having said that, I think it's less important to focus on individual groups, which kind of just comes down to branding a lot of time, and more important to focus on the ideology. So the groups come and go, they'll rise for a period of time, they'll break up, they'll dissolve. Those members who aren't arrested often just then resurface in different organizations that have a very similar ideology. So the base in particular is dead, but that ideology is alive and well, and remains a serious cause for concern. And then in terms of, the possibility of this becoming a mass political movement, I'm not sure about this country, and I don't want to, pull out a crystal ball and try and predict the future, but I think we're seeing something akin to that happening in the United States, where you see the vast majority of Republicans now believe that the past presidential election was stolen. And there's some really concerning research out of the University of Chicago. I forget the academic, but I recently read about it in an Atlantic article, and he found, doing some pretty significant widespread polling in society, he found roughly 21 million Americans who believe that not only is Donald Trump the rightful president of the United States, but that violence would be justified in reasserting him, imposing him in office. So when you're talking about 21 million Americans who believe that violence is justified to get Donald Trump back into the office, I think you are talking about a mass movement in some sense. It doesn't mean that it's highly organized and coordinated, but you're talking about a significant chunk of the American population that, is expressing a view that is, quite upfront about the fact that political violence is justified, given the current circumstances. So I think that's an incredible cause for concern. I'm worried about what we see in 2024. And despite the fact Canada has often been something of an island of stability on the global scene, if we have political instability and political violence breaking out to our south, I'm not sure how we insulate ourselves from that very effectively. So yeah, I mean, it is concerning to me that I think in the United States, you are seeing kind of a mass movement take shape right now.
So just quickly jumping in, Dr. Saad has mentioned the report Ryan was referring to is done by Dr. Robert Pape, if you have, and we have the report with us, and I've put it up in the Google Drive for your reference.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Thank you, Saad. Those two questions, thank you to Marianne and Kevin for posing those in the chat. I don't see any further, but I think we have Saad, you're raising your hand. Do you have a question? Go ahead.
Thank you, Ryan. This was so fascinating, and thank you for the amazing work that you've done. I had a quick question about the name they chose, because Al-Qaeda literally translated also means the base. So did you discover any connection, or whether they were aware of the sweet, sweet irony of all of this?
Yeah, that's one of the key questions with this group. So the founder of the base is a guy named Ronaldo Nazaro. He's a U.S. national. He's kind of got murky connections to like the CIA in the United States, and at the very least claimed to have been stationed in the Middle East, I think Afghanistan, as like a defense contractor or something. So I think it's quite likely that he knew that he was kind of doing a kind of ironic wink and a nod there in terms of the name that he chose for his group. It's also, I think, somewhat noteworthy that they were influenced and somewhat modeled themselves on organizational structures across the political spectrum. So they would, quite consciously look to documents written by, Al-Qaeda or ISIS propagandists in terms of guerrilla warfare tactics or things like that. Ronaldo Nazaro was quite interested in Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and then things like the Irish Republican Army. So pretty much wherever they could pull, information or tactics or organizational structure that they thought they could repurpose for their own white supremacist causes, they would be willing to do so. I think he knew what he was doing with that name. Other people, I don't think it's ever been definitively said one way or the other, but I think he knew, and it was a conscious wink.
Ryan, thank you. One thing, the word I haven't heard today is courage. And I think on behalf of everyone here, thank you for your courage and having infiltrated that team. And as you said, you may have saved some of our lives or the lives of people we know. Amazing. And I don't want to frustrate the team in not being able to ask too many questions. And so with that, I'll say that Ryan has agreed to act as, I'm not sure if we've labeled you yet, Ryan, an advisor,
No, yeah,
connector, a part of the team. We're going to see more and hear more and be able to tap into some of your knowledge and resources in the future, Ryan. So we're going to bring this session to a close, but you're welcome to stay around and join us. You might find the next session interesting. We're asking our teachers what their personal experience has been with radicalization. You may have a story may come out of this for you.
I would love to be able to say. I got to get back to work, unfortunately.
Okay.
But yeah,
Well,
you'll see more of me for sure.
Great. And then if you want to access the recording of this to hear what the teachers have said, that you're welcome to do that.
Oh yeah, I'll take you up on that.
Great. Thank you. Wonderful to have you. So with that, we're going to turn it back over to our teacher team.